Hello and welcome to the race data analysis for the US GP around Austin, Texas. This is the series in which we'll be compiling as much of the race data as I possibly can, mainly the lap times, and pitting each of the teammates against each other to see exactly how well they did against one another throughout this season. Every section of this video, from the race overview in just a little moment's time to every single team breakdown, is all timestamped in the description down below, so please feel free to skip to whichever segment of the video you'd like me to talk about. But without further ado, let us jump on into the race data for the US GP and take a quick look at the positional chart. Now, I have had a brief pickle with my race data, so exclude laps 1 to 2, as basically my lap time database wasn't working. So I've had to pull manually all of the lap times from the FIA documentation, which means I don't have the lap times for lap number 1, as it puts the race start time, not an actual lap time, from when the lights go out to when they cross the line. So the order that is on lap number 1 doesn't make any sense, as it has Bottas in P19, but from lap number 2/3 onwards to the end is correct. And we basically can see that not a great deal really happened. There was a lot of early pit stops from around lap 6 to laps 14. Then there were a couple pit stops in the mid phase of the race from some of the other races. And then again, not really much happened. It was a little bit of an anticlimactic, tense race at the US GP. We do, however, see a tense battle between Daniel Ricciardo and also Carlos Sainz between laps 38 and 40 as well. But from the positions table, we'll take a look now at the lap time chart. And actually, there was a lot more pit stops in this race than I was expecting. There were 41 overall for the entire grid, with also a VSC period at lap 26, which is that small little spike for absolutely everybody at lap 26. But zooming in on that main section of racing, we can see the enormous pace differential of each of the drivers. And in that opening stint, up until lap 10 sort of period, we have this massive pace disparity between the top couple of cars, which are the two Mercedes, and then also Charles Leclerc, and the rest of the midfield, which then also sort of separates into two overall. Then again, in the middle portion of the race, we have three bands of racing once again, but sort of vaguely, it's all starting to spread out just a little bit more. Again, as always, we have Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen at the front of this field. They pretty much set the fastest laps, either of them, for this whole race. And unfortunately, all the way at the back, we do have Nikita Mazepin, who was roughly 2 seconds at some points a lap slower than everybody else. And then right at the very end of the Grand Prix, we have Lewis Hamilton and also Max Verstappen, a class above the rest of the field, who are actually spread significantly close together. Now, this is a usual trend that we expect to see, where there is an enormous pace disparity between the whole field in the first stint of the race, but then as the race progresses, everything all starts to close up just a little bit, and all of the pace bands are basically the same, apart from Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen, who were both 1 second a lap faster than everybody else for those last 15 laps. They were in a league of their own. Then if we take a quick look at the gap to the race leader chart, we can see that Nikita Mazepin in that lime green actually goes off the top of the chart and finishes over 240 seconds off of the race lead overall, which is absolutely mammoth. And then from laps 38 onwards to the end, we can see Sergio Perez in that yellow line, and then also, I believe that is Charles Leclerc in the darker line. We can see them just slowly, around half a second to a second a lap, falling off of Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen in the blue and the grey. But what we can do with all of those lap times is we can isolate each driver's clean air lap. Now, a clean air lap is any lap time that a driver sets that is outside of 2.5 seconds of the car in front. I adjust this sort of time frame for each race, as sometimes 2.5 seconds is within the dirty air of another car, but 2.5 was a decent time frame for Austin. Then of these selected clean air laps, we then end up removing the slowest 30% and also the fastest 2 as well, just in case you set a fast lap at the very end of the Grand Prix, which is an unrealistic pace setting. We then average out all of those lap times, and we end up with a leaderboard that looks a little bit like this, with the average lap column just here, which Lewis Hamilton led just from Max Verstappen by 0.08 of a second, and then both of them were 6 tenths clear of Sergio Perez. But bear in mind also, Sergio Perez was feeling a little bit unwell, and then equally had no water. None for this entire Austin GP. So as well as being a ridiculously bumpy circuit and feeling unwell in himself, he had no water, so he couldn't hydrate himself. So he wasn't really feeling fantastic at the end of the race. Then Charles Leclerc was next up, a solid P4 ahead of Lando Norris and also Valtteri Bottas. We then have this gap converted into a percentage, which we can compare this percentage to all the remaining races that have happened so far this year. We then have the number of clean air laps that each driver had achieved this race, actually relatively high across this season so far. We then have this as a percentage of the total race, and then their standard deviation of their clean air lap times. But taking that middle percentage column and averaging it across all of the races that we have had so far and subtracting the quickest percentage from everything else, so we have the pace setter at 0, it is Max Verstappen who is still so far the fastest driver this season in clean air, with just 0.06% per lap back to Lewis Hamilton, where roughly 0.06% is around half a tenth, maybe 400ths at short circuits like Monaco, and then closer to 600ths at the longer circuits like Austin, for example. So to be within half a tenth of the fastest car, that is literally identical. That is per racing lap. There is then 0.24% back to Sergio Perez and just over 0.5% back to Valtteri Bottas. And then doing exactly the same for the teams. Again, Mercedes and Red Bull are a class above Ferrari and McLaren, but they are so very close, so neither car really has a massive pace advantage. Before, at the start of this season, it was Red Bull who were leading Mercedes by about 0.2% at one point, but now Mercedes have slowly clawed back just a little bit of pace performance, and they're pretty much even. And just for a quick visualization of where each of those drivers' clean air laps popped up during the race, we can see that the majority of them do fall in the last 50%, but there are a couple, for example the Haas and the Williams, and a couple of the Alpines and Alfa Tauris have some in the first 50% of this race. Now, to account for the fact that lap times set in the first 50% of the race are going to be considerably slower than lap times set in the second half of the race, I basically do this clean air lap analysis once again, but for each of the 3 stints that happened this Grand Prix. And for stint number 1, it looks a little bit like this. However, literally nobody set clean air laps in stint number 1, which is what the bracketed asterisk by each of the drivers' names means. So Carlos Sainz was on the softs, he set a 142.7, Pierre Gasly was on the mediums, a 144 flat, and then Nikita Mazepin was on the hards, a 145.6. They were the only drivers who set a clean air lap in stint number 1. So we take a look at stint number 2 instead, where people were on the mediums and also the hards. And once again, for that hard compound of tyre, it was Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen separated by just 0.06 of a second, and then a half a second back to Valtteri Bottas. So they were at all times this Grand Prix a class above the rest of the field. And on the medium compound of tyre, it was Sergio Perez who was miles quicker than the 2 Aston Martins, but 1.4 seconds is expected from a Red Bull down to the Aston Martin. Then from stint number 2, we will take a look at stint number 3, where once again it is Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen who top this leaderboard. However, this was the second stint where Hamilton was easily the quickest car on track, where he had the much fresher tyres compared to Verstappen, and in clean air he was about 0.6 a lap faster for those remaining 15 or so laps when he pitted onto those tyres. And then each driver once again was a class above the rest of the field, 1.2 seconds quicker than Charles Leclerc. And with the race overview and all of the clean air lap analysis all done and dusted, we will now break down each of the teams. We're going in 2020 Constructors' Championship order, so we start with Mercedes and we're going to end all the way at Williams. They're all timestamped in the description down below, so please feel free to skip to whichever team you would like me to talk about. But equally, I will be explaining all of the graphs that do pop up in the Mercedes panel, so if you want to stick around for the explanation, let's go through that now. So on screen is the Mercedes panel overall. Starting in the top left, we have their lap time chart. Lewis Hamilton is in the black line and Valtteri Bottas is in the turquoise. The grey dotted line is the fastest Mercedes car from the previous Austin GP. So that will be Valtteri Bottas from the 2019 Austrian GP. Then directly below that, we have the Mercedes gaps chart. This is the gap between the two cars on every single lap of the Grand Prix. We then have their positional chart in the top right, and again, remember to just exclude lap number 1. Valtteri Bottas didn't start at P19, that was a fault with my database of lap times. And then directly below that, we have the percentage pace difference between Hamilton and Bottas. This percentage pace difference takes all of Lewis Hamilton's lap times, will divide them all by Valtteri Bottas's lap times, convert them to a percentage, then any percentage that is above 100 is when Lewis Hamilton is going faster, any percentage below 100 is when Valtteri Bottas is going faster. These percentages then get ordered from largest down to smallest, and then we end up with the distribution that is on screen now, which we can split this down the middle, and we can see that for just 16% of the laps raced together, it was Valtteri Bottas who was the faster car, and then for 83.6%, it was Lewis Hamilton. And this is the largest Mercedes pace difference that we have observed all season long. So whether that shows it was a Bottas bad race, or it was a Hamilton masterclass, or a mixture of the two, not 100% sure, but either way, the largest gap that we have seen between them. And we can observe that from pretty much stint number 1, where there is a almost 2-second a lap gulf between the two drivers, where Valtteri Bottas is stuck behind the two Alfa Tauris, and Lewis Hamilton is waltzing away in the lead of the race. They then both come in for their pit stops, where again Hamilton maintains a sort of second per lap advantage over Bottas. They then have the small VSC period, where we have this small little spike in the gap, which shouldn't really happen under VSC, but it basically does every single time. Where we can see that just before the VSC, the gap was hovering around 43 seconds, and then after the VSC, it was actually down at 40 seconds. So there was a 3-second gain under the VSC in favour of Lewis Hamilton. However, this happens every single VSC period to every single driver on the grid. This will happen at every single time. So as much as they like to say it shouldn't affect any of the race gaps, it always does. Then post second pit stop, we again see a 2-second per lap gulf between the two drivers, and we can clearly see the consistency of Lewis Hamilton versus the inconsistency of Valtteri Bottas. But bear in mind, Bottas was battling with the Ferrari of Carlos Sainz near the end of the race, whereas Hamilton was just putting in consistent clean air laps all the way to catch up to Max Verstappen. But taking a look at Mercedes' pace in 2019 compared to 2020, it was actually half a second quicker in 2019. Now that's not as big of a deficit as we've seen this season so far. With the overall clean air lap pace of the entire race being 9/10 of a second between the two drivers. In stint number 1, neither driver set any clean air laps. In stint number 2, both on the hards, there was a half a second deficit. And in stint number 3, there was a 1.3 second deficit between the two drivers. And so from Mercedes, we'll now take a look at Red Bull. And again, splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that Sergio Perez in the darker blue line was faster for 18.2% of the laps raced, and Max Verstappen was faster for 81.8%. Now this is a fairly average Red Bull split. It's very majoritively been above 70-30 in favour of Max Verstappen. But unlike the Mercedes, we can see that they were actually very comparative in the opening stint up until their first pit stops, where there was probably a 1/10 or 2 advantage to Max Verstappen. Where again we have that small VSC period, which is just a little spike to the left in the gaps chart of my red arrow, and then we have of course their pit stops, which decreases the gap all the way down to pretty much nothing. But in exactly the same way as the Mercedes gaps chart at the end of the race, where Sergio Perez is starting to feel a little unwell and Max Verstappen is defending from Lewis Hamilton, we see this at times 3-second per lap gulf between the two cars open up. And so comparing their 2019 pace to 2020, 2019 was actually 7/10 faster than 2021. So interestingly, Mercedes actually lost less time, which is a trend that we haven't really observed at all this season, as Mercedes have been hampered significantly with this rule change, mainly the lower rake philosophied cars than the higher rake philosophied cars. So the trend that we have seen is that every team has lost time from either 2020/2019, but it has been Mercedes and Aston Martin that have lost a lot more than Red Bull and also Ferrari. With the gap between the two drivers being just half a second, and again stint number 1, no clean air laps. Stint number 2 on the hard and the medium for Sergio Perez, there was a 3/10 deficit, so on the slower compound of tyre, Verstappen was still faster. Then on stint number 3, where they were both on the hards, there was a 7/10 deficit between the two. Then from Red Bull, we'll take a look at McLaren, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 47.3% it was Daniel Ricciardo in the blue who was the faster of the two McLarens, and for 52.7% it was Lando Norris. Now this is an as even percentage split as you could want, so even though Ricciardo had a very stellar race and actually outperformed Lando Norris, he was at times just the slower car. And we can see that quite clearly taking a look at their lap time chart. In stint number 1, Daniel Ricciardo was just a touch more on the consistent side over Lando Norris, but the gap was staying at 3 seconds, right up until their first pit stop phase, where neither driver was able to take advantage of the fresh tyres, and they were setting pretty much identical lap times once again, and the gap stayed at 4 seconds for 16 laps. We then of course had the VSC period and then another set of pit stops for both drivers, and then in the second half of the race we can see a small little advantage for Lando Norris for a couple of laps, decreasing the gap from around 9 seconds back to 5, but then from lap 40 at 5 seconds it stayed all the way until the end of the race. But interestingly, the two McLarens actually tailed off in pace at the end of this race. They were setting lap times consistently under a minute 41 from laps 32 up to laps 44, but from laps 44 onwards, it started to increase back up above 1 minute 41. But taking a look at their 2019 pace compared to 2021, they were actually quicker in 2021 than 2019, and that is the only case of this happening in Austin, Texas. Admittedly, not by much, just by 0.03 of a second, but 2021 was still faster than 2019, with there being a 0.4 difference between the two drivers, where stint number 1, no clean air laps for either of the two, and stint number 2, there was just a 1/10.5 difference between them on the hard compound of tyre, and then in stint number 3, there was a 3.5 difference on the hard compound of tyre. Then from McLaren, we'll take a look at Aston Martin, splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle. For 31.5%, it was Lance Stroll in the pink who was the faster of the two cars, and for 68.5%, it was Sebastian Vettel, who did kind of wipe the floor just a little bit with Lance Stroll this race. However, both drivers had a very, very strong and exceptionally similar race, which we can see in their positional chart. They literally followed the same positions pretty much through this entire race. And looking at their lap charts, they were pretty much dead even in the opening portion. Admittedly, Sebastian Vettel in the dark green was actually a little bit more on the inconsistent side compared to Lance Stroll, with the gap staying at around 2 seconds. We then have the second phase of pit stops for the two cars, where Stroll comes in first and Vettel comes in second, and we can actually see that Sebastian Vettel loses out just a little bit, as the gap before Lance Stroll's pit stop was just over 5 seconds, and then when Sebastian came in and took his fresh tyres, the gap was actually just under 5 seconds. However, directly after this pit stop, Sebastian had the better tyres and was able to consistently lap so much quicker, at times over a second faster than Lance Stroll all the way to the end of the race. And Aston Martin's lap times compared to 2019 looked a little like this. There was a 1 second deficit, a 1.1 second deficit between 2019 and 2021, one of the largest that we have seen so far this year, with there just being a 700th difference between the two drivers across the entire race, with once again no clean air laps in stint number 1, and there being a 2.5 difference in stint number 2. And then in stint number 3, it was Stroll who failed to set any clean air laps on the hards, whereas Vettel did. Then from Aston Martin, we'll take a look at Alpine, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 28.2% of the laps raced together, it was Esteban Ocon in the white who was the faster of the two cars, and therefore for 71.8%, it was Fernando Alonso in the dark blue. And looking at their lap charts, both drivers were actually exceptionally similar, although there was a large pace difference between the two. The gap was staying at 20 seconds for around 20 laps. We then of course have the small VSC period and the pit stop period, which spikes the gap in Fernando Alonso's favour to just over 50 seconds. Then after this pit stop, we have Ocon actually starting to slow down, as he does end up retiring at lap number 40, compared to Alonso, who ended up retiring on lap 48. And taking a look at Alpine's pace from 2019 to 2021, they were faster by 1.3 seconds, actually more than what Aston Martin was in 2019, with there being a 1.5 second deficit between Ocon and Alonso. Once again, in stint number 1, no clean air laps. In stint number 2, it was 1.8 seconds between the two drivers on the hards, and then when Alonso went onto the mediums and Ocon on the hards in stint number 3, it was 2.3 seconds. Then from Alpine, we'll take a look at Ferrari, splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle. For 18.2% of the race, it was Carlos Sainz who was the faster of the two cars in the black line, and therefore for 81.8%, it was Charles Leclerc, another significant teammate difference. And in that opening stint, we can see that he was roughly 2 to 3 tenths a lap quicker than Carlos Sainz, spiking the gap to 5 seconds after around 10 laps. However, after the first round of pit stops, we can see that he extends this advantage to up to 15 seconds after just 26 laps. Where then after the second round of pit stops, he's able to extend this pace advantage to almost half a second to 6 tenths per lap, where he increases the gap all the way to 30 seconds at the end of the checkered flag. With Ferrari's 2019 pace looking a little bit like this, they were 8 tenths quicker in 2019 compared to 2021, with a 1.4 second deficit between the two drivers in clean air, with Sainz actually setting a clean air lap on his softs in stint number 1, but Leclerc not, and then vice versa in stint number 2, and then in stint number 3 it was Leclerc who had a 1.5 second advantage over Sainz. And so from Ferrari, we'll now take a look at Alfa Tauri. Splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 46.2% of the laps raced together, which was just 13, it was Yuki Tsunoda in the white who was the faster of the two cars, and therefore for 53.8%, it was Pierre Gasly in the black. Now unfortunately, there isn't a great deal that we can actually read into this lap time chart, as Pierre Gasly in the black ended up retiring so early on. But what we can do is take a look at the pace difference of the AlphaTauris to 2019. There was a 2.6 second deficit between their 2019 pace and their 2021 pace. With Pierre Gasly setting a clean air lap on his mediums in stint number 1, but obviously retiring at stint number 2 and then also stint number 3, so it was just Yuki Tsunoda who set these lap times. Then from AlphaTauri, we'll take a look at Alfa Romeo, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, it was an exact 50-50 split between Raikkonen and Giovinazzi. These two have been one of the most inseparable teammate pairings of this season. Where in the opening stint we can see a small spike in the gap in favour of Kimi Raikkonen in the red arrow over Giovinazzi in the white, as Giovinazzi comes in for his pit stop very early on. Raikkonen then comes in for his first just a couple of laps after, and we can see that he was able to take full advantage of his fresh tyres by going a second a lap faster than Giovinazzi, right up until the VSC period at lap number 26. We then have a second pit stop for Kimi Raikkonen, and then no further pit stops for Antonio Giovinazzi, where both drivers set near identical lap times, with the gap staying at 5 seconds pretty much all the way to the end of the race. Where Alfa Romeo's pace difference to 2019 looked a little bit like this, much like Mercedes, they were half a second quicker in 2019 to 2021, with there being a 1.3 second deficit between the two drivers across the whole race in Giovinazzi's favour, neither setting clean air laps in stint 1 or stint 2, with the 1.3 second deficit coming in stint number 3. Then penultimately from Alfa Romeo, we'll take a look at Haas, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 22.6% it was Nikita Mazepin who was the faster of the two cars in the white, and therefore for 77.4% it was Mick Schumacher in the grey who was the faster of the two Haas. Now Mazepin did get a lot of stick in this Grand Prix for being so significantly slower than Mick Schumacher. However, in the opening lap of the race, his headrest actually came loose overall, so he had to come in for a technical pit stop because it literally almost flew out of the car. So on lap number 1, he'd already dropped to almost half a minute behind Mick Schumacher. He was then able to claw back some of this lap time when Mick actually came into the pits. However, we can see that after this stop, there was a 2-second gulf per lap consistently for 12 laps, which re-extended this gap to well above half a minute by the time that Nikita Mazepin came in for his stop, which spiked the gap in Mick's favour to 60 seconds. And then once again, we can see a ridiculous pace gulf, at times 6 seconds per lap, for just a couple of laps, which rose the gap almost to 80 seconds at the end of this race. So it appears that there is a relatively large pace difference between the two Haas cars, but Mazepin goes through these phases of dropping a ridiculous amount of time once or twice per race. So he'll be on pretty much the same strategy as Schumacher, but Schumacher will just execute it really well, and Mazepin will not. So I don't want to say they're similar on pace, because they're not. There is a pace gulf, but it's just Mazepin having these odd mistakes here or there, either a spin, a slow pit stop, an inconvenience something or other, or slow getting out of the way of the blue flags, that will increase this gap dramatically over a really short span of laps, and then the gap will just gently increase over time. So if he didn't have these large mistakes just once or twice every race, the gap wouldn't be anywhere near as big and noticeable. But taking a look at the Haas pace compared to 2019, we can see that there was a 1.1 second difference between 2019 and 2021. With stint number 1, it was Mazepin who was the only one to set clean air laps on his hards. Then in stint number 2, it was actually Nikita Mazepin who was the quicker of the two cars by just half a tenth of a second. However, stint number 3, it was 1.4 seconds in Mick Schumacher's favour. Then from Haas, we'll finally take a look at Williams, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, for 25.9% of the race it was Nicholas Latifi in the blue who was the faster of the two cars, and therefore for 74.1% it was George Russell in the white. Now this is actually one of the more extreme Williams trends. Usually we expect Latifi to be a lot closer to George Russell in terms of race pace, but if we head back to the lap chart we can vaguely see that in lap number 1. However, there were some extremely early pit stops for Williams which spiked the gap in Russell's favour to 30 seconds. Then Russell came in and lap number 8. And we can see that post this pit stop, they were pretty much identical. There was maybe 2 to 3 tenths between the two drivers. However, the main pace difference opened up after the second round of pit stops and after the VSC period, where Russell was around 4 to 5 tenths per lap different to Nicholas Latifi, who actually had a small little mistake on lap 48, which is that large lap time, probably getting out of the way of a faster car behind. Then taking a look at the Williams pace in 2019, we can see that they were 1 second quicker in 2021 than 2019. And this is a trend that we actually have seen from Williams, where they have gained time this year on their previous years, which just goes to show how dog shite their cars have been the past couple of years. With again neither driver setting clean air laps in stint number 1, and in stint number 2, Russell didn't set any, and stint number 3, there was an 8/10 difference in Russell's favour. And there we go, there is the race data analysis all done and dusted for the USGP from Austin, Texas. Please let me know in the comments down below what your favourite bit about this data analysis was and what you found interesting about the Austin GP. But that is all I've got for you today, guys. I hope you have enjoyed, and I'll catch you in the next episode with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.